Welcome to DataViz Daily. I'm Kevin McGinley, and I took off a little bit last week because I was working on a webinar for the ODTUG user community on using Data Visualization Desktop as a means to tell a data story. And one of the interesting things that I did in this webinar is actually use Data Visualization Desktop as the entire presentation tool instead of using conventional tools like Keynote or PowerPoint. So what I thought I'd do today is actually talk a little bit about some of the things that I did during that process, some of the things that I learned, and some little tips and tricks that you kind of have to go through as a result of using Data Visualization Desktop in this capacity. So you can see here I've got two project files that I'm going to be working with here, and one of the first things that I can tell you is that it's often very helpful to separate your entire presentation into multiple project files because of the potential size that these project files will get from something along the lines of a 45-minute to an hour presentation. If you're not used to giving presentations that long, they can sometimes accumulate a lot of slides, and in those situations these project files get rather large, especially when you start incorporating some of the components that I'm going to show you. So that's sort of tip number one, is that it's oftentimes necessary to break your entire presentation, depending on how long it is, into multiple project files. So let's go into this first project file to talk about a few things related to it. So as we open this up, so you're going to see here that, again, we have this sort of difference between the visualize area and the narrate area. And it's really going to be the narrate area that you're going to spend most of your time on. So while you are going to see here that I've got quite a number of canvases open here that do a variety of different things, it's really this narrate area where you're going to sort of do your work in the visualize, capture an insight using this. But you can even then, as you accumulate a number of insights, actually use this button over here to add an empty insight. And it's really going to be the insights that you're going to want to capture a collection of, because when you go into presentation mode, it's going to show the insights, not your different canvases. So depending on how you're sort of doing this and how you sort of start structuring your presentation, it's actually going to be quite advantageous to be just adding a bunch of insights from the narrate area of the tool and using the ability to add empty insights. Now, something else you're going to notice here along the bottom is that I've actually named my insights letters of the alphabet, and switching from one insight to the next can sometimes be a little slow and sluggish. That's one of the things that you have to get used to when using this tool in this manner, is that it's not as fast as using a tool like PowerPoint or Keynote. But why did I rename all of my tabs or insights here to letters? Well, you can see here that I go all the way up, despite my sort of change in my order here between A and B. I go the whole way up to U, which are quite a large number of insights. And if I use this sort of standard naming convention, these tabs would get really wide and I would not be able to see all of them on the screen. So by changing them to a letter, I'm trying to maximize as much as possible the ability to kind of see my tabs easily. Now, you might ask yourself, well, why not use a number? And you could use a number. I chose letters because it was a little bit more straightforward for me. And if I wanted to sort of switch between one to the other, it was easy to kind of switch the letters around. I also thought that was better than potentially getting into a situation where I've got double digits going on. This way I always keep it to a single character instead of having 10, 11, 12, etc., and having two digits there taking up more space. So that's the first thing that you're going to want to sort of notice. The second thing is when it comes to sort of how you structure the sort of notion of showing texts versus pictures, and how you show both text and pictures at the same time, and how you want that to sort of look and feel. So as you can see here, I've got a slide very much focused on text. It's kind of like my title slide, and I'm not really bothering with any images here because really this is, sort of all about the text. But if we hop to another slide here later, you'll see that I do actually combine images with text. And what I do in this instance is I actually have autofit turned on from a properties perspective. So if we look at the canvas properties, for example, we've got autofit turned on here, and I'll show you an example where I turned it off in a moment. And the reason for that is when it comes down to sort of how you want to size your images and your text, it's a lot easier to control in presentation mode. When you click on this and the screen expands, it's a little bit easier to control that, sort of using the autofit capability. So the next thing to kind of note is when you're actually using the images themselves and go into the image properties, there is the mechanism here to autofit the image as well, and what that allows you to do is as you go into presentation mode, the image will grow to sort of fit the screen. Doesn't look the way you want it to when you're first in the insight, but when you switch into that presentation mode, everything sizes better to fit the screen. There are a couple instances where you may not want this, and let me see if I can find one of them quickly here. Actually, I think they're a little bit further down. And that's when I actually overlaid a visualization on top of an image. And there are pros and cons to this. On the one hand, as you do it, and here you can see here I've got this going on, I've got a performance tile on top of a graphic. Well, this is great, but as soon as I go into presentation mode, now I've got all this white space over here that wasn't apparent to me before. And that's because I have to go into freeform mode. And freeform mode is nice in that I can size things exactly the way I want them, but when I go into presentation mode, they don't grow and expand to fill the screen. So that's one downside to that, is you kind of have to live with this extra white space. The other thing is that, as of right now, there's no way to make visualizations transparent. So they are always going to have some sort of background. So as you choose images and you do want to layer visualizations on top of images, you have to make sure that your images are designed in such a way that they create a nice space for you to put the visualization into. Something that's not going to block the primary thing that you're trying to get someone to see within the image itself. So those are a few tips. Let me jump back here into the second one and talk about some things. This is more the data part of the story. So these slides in that project were really just kind of setting the scene and starting to sort of tell a little bit of the message that I was trying to get across related to telling a story. Here we actually get into looking at some of the data and trying to visualize some of the data. Now, the first thing that you note here is that I'm using a combination of images and visualizations here. In case you weren't aware of this, you do have the ability, to come down here, and both text and images are available to you as additional things that can be put on a particular canvas. Now, in this instance, what I chose to do is I used the text in the insight description as the sort of key message that I wanted to get across on the screen. I could have easily have dragged a text box up here beside this image and done the same thing, but I chose to use the sort of area at the bottom. When you go into presentation mode, it shows up down here. So that's, sort of the first thing to point out. The next thing to point out is over the course of a data story, you're going to want to use colors to highlight things in sort of very specific ways. So if I jump to this particular insight, for example, I'm going to see that I used color. Next one. I use color to try to help me understand, or emphasize a particular item to call out. Here it was that the month of July was a very high month for UFO sightings. Well, unfortunately, depending on how your entire presentation goes, you might need to do yourself a favor and do what I did here and duplicate some of your measures so that you can color them accordingly. What I did here is actually had to create one that I could keep gray and one that I could have red for in instances where I wanted to call out a specific month like this with one color. I had to use this particular measure, but back here on my line charts where I wanted my line to be red and not gray, I had to use this row count red and go into the color assignments to actually show that particular measure was regular row count was going to be gray, plain row count was going to be red, and then on the instances where I wanted to highlight just one particular series value, I could do that red accordingly and have the rest be gray. So that's another example of how I used something within this to sort of tell the story. So duplicating your measures so that you could color them uniquely was a pretty valuable thing. So a couple other things that are sort of worth pointing out here. So we saw how I was using color to sort of emphasize the contrast of how I wanted to call out data points. There are also other ways to do that as well. And so as we look at, for example, the difference between H, inside H here, and what we have going on here is a scatter plot. So this was a way to sort of tell the sort of story of the difference between looking at the filter one way and looking at the entire data set and calling out how much of a difference there was in sort of outliers between the entire data set versus the filter data set. So putting those sort of visualizations side by side was one way to sort of help tell that story. Another point that's sort of interesting to call out here in terms of how you can use things within the tool is the occurrence of the sort of reference lines. So whether they're averages, constants, trends, etc., it's a way for you to sort of really call out something related to this around, in this instance, how high above the average that these two particular values are. In actuality, it's 3 times over the average. So there are a variety of different ways here that you can sort of use this tool to tell the story. But ultimately, it comes down to, when you're sort of in presentation mode, this idea of sort of using the navigation feature here to walk you through the particular points that you want to make about the data. And so it's very important to sort of line those up in a very logical fashion so that as you're sort of building the next visualization, it is building on the previous ones and sort of showing a particular key point. So here we go from a geographical view of particular states to identifying sort of where the key areas are and showing that in a much different fashion here in the next visualization, which is going to be a tree map focused on those particular states that were high in sighting counts. So that's one way in which you can sort of build up to the elements that you want to focus on the most in the story and show the things that are sort of most relevant as you progress down a logical path. And that's sort of the last point that I want to make about using this tool to tell a story. There was a lot of analysis that I had to do, a lot of different sort of flipping around of the visualizations and sort of rearranging them to get to a particular insight that made sense to me. I don't show all of that during the presentation. So even though I've got well over a dozen slides here, if you will, that tell this data story, there are many, 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 many more iterations of all of these visualizations and layouts and filters that I went through to kind of figure out how the story worked. And so, the key point here is that you're sort of explaining, not exploring. So a good visualization story should be about explaining what you found during the exploring phase, which this tool is very good at helping you explore the data, but not everybody wants to see all those iterations that you went through until you found something. So that's where capturing the insights as you go, finding the things that matter most, then arranging them into a story, going back and sort of tweaking them to change colors and really highlight things to really make them very easy to see and digestible from your audience's perspective. So those are some examples of using this tool as a presentation tool to tell a data story from my webinar that I gave last week on using Data Visualization Desktop to tell a data story. This has been Kevin McGinley for DataViz Daily. Thanks for watching.